Welcome to Rainbows Are Circles, a podcast exploring human potential and everyday wonder. What possibilities open up for us when we explore life with optimism, curiosity, and an open mind? Join me, Julie Malari, as we wake up to wonder and speak with inspirational guests on the topics of personal development, alternative health, and even magical, mystical, yet often misunderstood practices. Are you ready? Yeah. Hi everyone, Happy New Year! And welcome back to Rainbows Are Circles. Thank you so much for joining me on our first episode of 2021. This year, I'm excited to announce that I'll be on a more consistent podcasting schedule. I'll be releasing episodes twice a month this year, and this could potentially increase, but for now, I'm starting with 2 episodes a month so that I know I can live up to my commitment. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so that you can be updated whenever a new episode comes out. And if you've been enjoying the show, I have a wee little request for you. Please leave a rating and review for the podcast on your favorite podcasting platforms. This affects the algorithms of the platform so that other people can find the show more easily. Lastly, if you're loving Rainbows Are Circles and would like to get bonus content, early access to the episodes, guided meditations, and even exclusive discounts on the services from some of our podcast guests, join our Patreon membership. By becoming a member, you support the podcast with just a few dollars a month, and you get fun, cool, exclusive content in exchange. You may notice, at least as of today, I don't have any advertisements on my website or my podcast, and I'd really like to keep it that way. This means I'm not earning any income for the show, and the only source of funding comes from my Patreon members. If you'd like to join our membership and support Rainbows Are Circles, just visit patreon.com/rainbowsarecircles. Thank you. To kick us off for the new year, we are bringing back the wonderful, fabulous, evolutionary astrologer Eileen Mello to talk to us about some huge astrological shifts happening right now in our very own solar system and how these shifts may affect us humans as individuals and as a collective here on planet Earth. You might remember Eileen from episode number 5, How Astrology Can Guide and Empower Us. If you're not familiar with astrology, you may want to listen to that episode first to familiarize yourself with the basics. Essentially, astrology is a study of how the interaction of the planets, the sun, and the moon affect us humans here on Earth. As Eileen will mention, astrology is not a belief system, but is actually based on empirical evidence. I'll let her explain more about that in today's interview. Eileen has been immersed in astrology since the age of 10. She's a second-generation evolutionary astrologer taught by her mother, a master astrologer. Most recently, Eileen was the managing editor at the esteemed magazine, The Mountain Astrologer. Although she's a native Californian, Eileen has traveled extensively across the globe and has even lived in Africa, Asia, and Europe. She holds a BA in psychology, as well as philosophy and religion, and an MA in women's studies and religion. Let's welcome Eileen Mello to the show. So Eileen, for those of us who are new to astrology, can you just define what astrology is?
Yes. So astrology is the practice of looking at how the planetary cycles affect an individual. And what astrologers for thousands of years and historians have discovered is that the planetary bodies are interconnected pretty intimately with specific archetypes of human expression. So Jung is actually the person who coined the word archetypes. And it is another one of these big words, right, that needs to be defined. And archetypes are subconscious expressions of, they don't have to be subconscious, but they're expressions of the human psyche. And so they're often subconscious. And so as we move through life, we're all experiencing different themes. Archetypes, themes can be synonymous in some way. For example, being a mother, being a student, being a warrior, these types of archetypes. And there's only so many archetypes that we have in the human experience, and they coincide with the planetary bodies. And so this is astrology, is looking at how the planetary bodies and the archetypes associated with them are affecting us individually and also collectively, which is what we're diving into a little bit more today in this podcast.
Awesome. Thank you for explaining that. If you are interested in astrology, if you've heard anything about astrology recently, you will probably have heard that there are a lot of really big shifts happening now and happened recently, last month in December 2020, like the grand conjunction, I believe. So Eileen, can you just explain to us what shifts are happening and how these shifts are affecting us?
Sure. Yeah. So what happened in December that was much talked about is the great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. And the reason this was really significant is that so each planet has a different orbit, meaning that they move through the heavens at a different speed, essentially. And Jupiter moves more quickly than does Saturn. And every 20 years, they come together in a conjunction, which means they're together in the heavens. So even though they're meeting every 20 years, what happened in December is that it was on the winter solstice, so the 21st, is that they came together in the sign of Aquarius. And Aquarius is an air sign. And it is the first time in 200 years that Jupiter and Saturn have come together in an air sign. There's been one exception, and that was in 1981. And if I go into that, it will confuse listeners because it's pretty technical. So just accept that the 1981 exception, was an air. And this is related to the orbit of the planets, right? It's astronomical. And so what happens is that every 200 years, Jupiter and Saturn conjunct and they change elements. So the sign in which they conjunct in is a new element. So the last 200 years, Jupiter and Saturn every 20 years met in earth signs. And now for the next 200 years, they will be meeting in air signs. And this is pretty significant because we won't see, like, folks who are alive now are experiencing this transition from Jupiter and Saturn meeting in earth to Jupiter and Saturn now meeting in air. And we won't experience another elemental shift in our lifetimes, right? That comes in 200 years.
Unless we live for a really long time.
And I like that you say that because and we call, by the way, so it's the great conjunction that happened, but it also, if you have heard the term, the grand mutation, it's the mutation of the elements. So the shift from earth to air. So a lot of people are hearing both of these phrases, the great conjunction, the grand mutation. And I like that you said the living for 200 years because Aquarius is the sign of innovation, advancement, technology. And so there will be an increased emphasis on technological advancement. And that's what we saw in 1981, right? So all the 80s babies were the millennial generation. We're the elder millennials. We're the ones who had the Game Boy in our hands when we were 6, 7, 8 years old. We were the first to have a device, right? And so even though it was this one-time Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in air, it really heralded what we can expect for these next, or a flavor of what's going to continue with this energy. And so technological advancement is a significant aspect of that.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. So Saturn and Jupiter conjuncted in the air sign on the
Aquarius
solstice.
Yeah.
And what does that mean for us?
Yeah. So whenever we have a significant shift of energy, like we're having from earth to air, we as collectively and individually. So that's an important distinction to make, is that we experience this individually in our lives, but then we're also getting these themes collectively. And so we will begin to have, I mean, we already live in a technological era where, you know, our devices are almost like a third hand, right? It's like it's always there. It's an appendage at this point. But if you look at just the shift from earth to air, earth energy is very dense. You can look at it very literally, like earth is mountains, it's your feet on the ground, it's the trees that grow in soil, it's our physical bodies that you know, move through life. Earth is the material world, has to do with money, structures, all the things that we think of as being residents of this planet. Now, air transcends what we're doing just here on the ground, right? And so it is another realm that, yeah, we fly, but we don't have so much experience of the domain of air in the way that we do with earth, right? Because we are always on the earth, and so that in itself is different. But the more symbolic manifestations of air is that air is representative of spirit and the intellect as well. So air signs in the zodiac are associated with communication, talking, the mind, etc. So there's a shift from like earthly survival material concerns to a more transcendent concern. We can see this both in terms of, I hope that it manifests a lot as more concern for spirit, right? Having a stronger spiritual connection. But it also has to do with, if you think, again, going back to kind of like a literal representation of the air element, birds flying through the sky. So birds have a much different experience and perspective of the earth than humans do and other animals do. And birds, especially if you think of, say, an eagle or a hawk that's soaring high above, has a much larger extended vision of the planet than we do on the ground. And so air is really associated with taking a wider perspective and having the ability to see far reaching. So it's futuristic thinking because it can see more of the whole than we can down on earth, right? So Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius is, well, especially Saturn in Aquarius is quite indicative of social reform, because it's this strong visionary quality. I keep using that word, but it's perfect. It's strongly innovative and visionary. So when we're in Earth, it's very associated with structures and density and like I said, survival. Whereas air can say, okay, this structure that we have, this law that we have, was implemented at a time when it did a lot of good and was maybe very helpful. But now we're 30 years in the future and it doesn't serve us anymore. So it needs to be changed in some way. We need to look toward the future and see how our existing structures and policies and lifestyles generally are, whether or not they're conducive and whether or not they're healthy and what needs to shift and change. So we can expect to see reform in that way. And again, this is individual and collective. So you'll see it in terms of, we're already starting to see this energy all over the planet. We're having major social reforms everywhere from Hong Kong to Brazil to Black Lives Matters in the United States, right? So that's not surprising to anyone. But in our individual lives, how are we experiencing that, right? So this conjunction, this energy came at the end of 2020, and that's not, 2020 will be a historical year, and it's reoriented us in profound ways. And some people, I think, are not reoriented yet. They're still in that shock phase of like, oh my God, what's going to happen? But that's where this energy is going to help us step out of the, I think, like the trauma of 2020 to envision something new, and having kind of the collapse of this earthly energy, the structures that we had in place and this routine that we were mindlessly, people commuting to work. And there wasn't a lot of thought about whether or not it was healthy for our societies. And now we know it's not. I mean, we knew before that it wasn't, but we couldn't stop ourselves from doing just what we were accustomed to doing, right? It required too much energy, and there's been a lack of leadership globally as well to making that shift. So Jupiter and Saturn coming in are going to create an infusion of energy that allows us to have the vision for the future that we would like to see. So this is applicable to your individual life and the collective. Like, what do you want to see for your own personal life? What changes need to be made? What vision can you hold for the future to start working toward, like a truly a different lifestyle for yourself?
Oh, so many things came through my head when you were talking about that. So 2020 was it was a really challenging year for many people for many reasons. But out of that turmoil and out of those challenges, something always grows. Something is always born. So I invite listeners to think back on 2020 and ask yourself, like, okay, yeah, maybe these things happened that were really hard, but what came out of it that is maybe helping me to grow or to see things in a new way or to take like a wider perspective? What has happened that actually was for my betterment. Is that a word? For my betterment as a person. So just a quick example, I'm a flight attendant and a yoga teacher, and I do love being a flight attendant, but it does take up a lot of time, and it can be hard to be so on the move all the time and to be so ungrounded all the time. And when COVID hit, I wasn't flying anymore. And it kind of forced me to just stop and stay indoors and not move around so much and not travel so much. And it gave me so much time to just read and like do all these cool new hobbies and like take more walks and like cook more. And I started having a weekly meal with my cousin and my mom and my boyfriend. And we would have like these 5-hour dinners where we all will cook something and like drink wine. And it was just like so much fun to just slow down. And now, I have this time to reflect and what I really want to do. And what I want to do is put more time into this podcast and into things that are more meaningful to me. Not that flying is not meaningful, but it's just not the main thing that I want my life to be about. So I invite you to maybe take some time to reflect on how this past year has affected you and how it's encouraging your growth or a different perspective. That was like kind of a simple tool that I just offered, but are there any other like tips or tools that you can recommend to people to work with this energy so they can really harness it and use it for good this year?
Yeah. So I do. I have two things. The first is that if you don't already have some sort of relaxation practice, meditation or otherwise, then I really strongly encourage people to cultivate silence in their life, quiet. It doesn't have to be extreme silence, it can be you out taking a walk in nature, whatever that means for you. But we are in a digital information age, and that is not going to change as we work increasingly remotely, right? And as we know, we're watching the service industry basically collapse. So the service industry it has to change pretty dramatically, but also more and more people are going online to earn their living and their income. And of course, we're already seeing, I don't think I need to point out to anybody the detriment of all of our online time, right? Being behind a screen. At this point, we're all pretty aware of the effects. So cultivating a practice of quiet and even solitude to some extent. I know that that'll make people cringe after our isolation here, but there's a difference between isolation and solitude. And specifically, the reason I say this is that Aquarius is the mind, and it can be a very detached energy and an energy that doesn't drop into the body. And so it becomes frenetic, and it can be very like disassociated even. And having that time to settle into the body will really help ground during a time that is going to be extremely focused on fast-paced mental communications and interactions with folks. Secondly, I really do want to encourage people, I practice evolutionary astrology, which is the belief that the soul incarnates multiple lifetimes and that each incarnation we're learning specific lessons so that our soul can evolve. Now, I have a very strong spiritual practice, and I bring that into my astrological consultation and teaching. And in keeping, Julie, with the invitation that you extended to listeners, I would go one step further and ask people to contemplate what their spiritual beliefs are. And I think you can be an atheist and have some sort of spiritual practice, like maybe you love the environment or you love animals, or, environmental, ecological stewardship is extremely important to you, whatever it is. So cultivating really a strong sense of the reality that we are all interconnected. If we burn the rainforest, we feel it in California, and we feel it in Europe, and we feel it in Australia. It doesn't matter where you are, we are all interconnected. And there is some spiritual aspect there. And you can use your own terminology, your own languaging, but really, finding a value around spirit during this time will help folks navigate quite a lot.
How would you define spirituality? Like just a belief in something that connects us all?
I mean, that's good. I like that. I don't know that I have a definition for spirituality. Yeah, I think, it is. And I don't even know if I would use the word belief. It's because for me, my spirituality is lived experience. So it's not, and this is, you had when we were dialoguing electronically, Julie, you asked me if there was something else that I would like to share about astrology at the end. But this thing that I came up with was that astrology is not a belief system. Astrology is empirical, which is scientific method, which means that anybody who studies astrology, seriously studies astrology, will see that these archetypal patterns happen over and over and over and over and over again until you are 100% convinced that the planets are associated with certain trends and events and characteristics in life. Okay, so not a belief system. Evolutionary astrology brings in the belief system that the soul incarnates. I cannot prove that the soul incarnates. I've had direct experience that leads me to believe that I've had multiple lifetimes, but I can't actually explain that in any way, right? Like you could explain it as epigenetics, parallel lives. There's all different types of explanations. It's not empirical, so that's the belief there. But spirituality for me is lived experience that my actions actually affect other people, down to the most minute actions that sometimes I don't even know how they're affecting other people, but they are, because we're all breathing the same air and we're all made of the same stuff. The trees require the same ether that I require, right? So that's where I think spirituality needs to go, is less from, and that is very much Aquarian nature. Like Aquarius does not want to be pinned down into any kind of dogma or belief system. It wants to have its own unique, original version of life across the board. Okay, be it relationships or spirituality. It's like, what does that mean for you? Right. And I think this is really one of the reasons that people are suffering today, and we're having so much mental illness and addiction problems, is because nobody has any source of nurturing from spirit. Like we're completely disassociated from it.
I think it's really helpful and really beautiful to think of it in that way, that we are simply all connected. Everything that we do or say or don't do or say affects our environment and other people and the people that they interact with and the people that they interact with. we need to stop thinking that we're just like these individual things moving around and nothing affects nothing. Everything affects everything and everything matters. And whether you go on a walk and you like smile at somebody or you just like look forward and ignore them, that actually affects how they experience their day or the next 10 minutes and whether they smile at the next person. You know, it's all these little things that add up. So how, how do we want to live, and how do we want to interact with each other and with this world? So the two tools that you mentioned were to cultivate more silence and also to reflect on what your spiritual beliefs are.
I would like to add that it's really imperative that folks be as flexible as possible. This energy, all air energy is associated with mutability, meaning that things change quickly. And so I know this was one of the harder things for folks about 2020 is all of the routines, everything that we knew just kind of collapsed overnight, right? And that's more difficult for some people than it is for others. And that's part of the astrological makeup. But moving forward, being as flexible and having as few expectations as possible is going to be increasingly important because we are moving really quickly, and the experience of time speeding up is going to continue with Aquarius, with Jupiter, Saturn, and air.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So it's going to feel like time is going faster?
I mean, that's already been happening the last few years. Younger folks aren't experiencing it, but definitely older people. I'm not even 40, and I'm experiencing that where it's like, oh my God, like time just is moving so quickly now. And so, like we're in an information age. And so what we're experiencing is how do I want to say this? It's not even just that time has the feeling of speeding up. It's really that things are just changing more rapidly, right? Like as soon as we get settled with one thing, it's changing for one reason or another. And come on, like we really as humans need to wake up to the fact that we're in a really bad position with climate change. Hello, are you paying attention? Is anybody paying attention? So climate change alone is causing people to be pivoting constantly. I know this is a big word now, pivot, after 2020. You got to adapt, right? And so people who really want to go back into this, no, I need my routine and and the structure, like you need to find an inner structure and an inner routine, because you're not going to get it from the external world anymore. You're just not. I know that's like a hard pill to swallow for some people. I'm saying it kind of gruffly. I don't mean it that way. This is why I suggest cultivating a spiritual practice, and silence is really important, because when you can tune in on the inside, then you do have a sense of grounding, even when what's happening outside your window is chaos.
Yes. Yeah. That's why grounding practices like meditation or just silent sitting, tuning into nature more are so helpful for that. It's interesting that you said that time seems to be speeding up, because it wasn't until you said that I was like, yeah, I feel like time is going so fast. And actually just yesterday, I got so frustrated with like feeling like I should always be doing something and that I should always be like super productive, that I was like, screw it. I'm going to like just do whatever I want to do today. And it was so good. Like I slept in, I was in bed till like 11 and I was like reading my book and I was like doing some breathing in bed. And then, I like rearranged, I'll just show you this. I rearranged my plant shelf. Nice. And I replanted a ton of them so that they just looked happier. And I made candles, and I watched The Karate Kid, which is such a good movie. I forgot what that movie is.
It really is.
And then, you know what? It felt like I had so much time. It felt like the day was longer because I had taken this time. Oh, and I rearranged my altar. I did some reading. I just did all this stuff that just fed my soul and that I wanted to do. And I was so happy. And I didn't feel like, whenever I'm just checking off my to-do list, I feel like the day is so short and fast and stressful. And oh my gosh, I'm so glad that you said to just cultivate more quiet time and slowing down, because that really does like stretch time out, and it makes
it
enjoyable.
Yeah. Yeah. My spiritual teacher, his name is Adyashanti. He's California based. He says that meditation is the art of doing nothing. And I love that because I love doing nothing. Like we're all so busy all the time. And I know FOMO is a thing, but often like really what we want to do is nothing, right? Nothing, just nothing. So when he said that, I was like, that really helps me actually. The days where I don't want to meditate for some reason, I'm feeling a resistance. I'm like, it's the art of doing nothing. And I actually want to do nothing. So therefore I want to meditate.
Yes. And as my cousin Freezy says, change your FOMO to JOMO, the joy of missing out.
Yeah, I like it. I really like that. That's adorable. Yep.
Oh, Eileen, this has been so much fun. Is there anything else you wanted to share before we wrap up today?
Yes, actually, I think that, a lot of astrologers are very optimistic about the next few years. And it's not that we aren't aware of the enormous challenges that we have as a global society, and environmental challenges being, high up there on the list. However, historically, periods in which periods in which Saturn is in Aquarius, which happens, at every 28, 30 years, Saturn goes around the entire zodiac and comes back. So you can even reflect back on your own life 30 years ago, what was happening. But when Saturn occupies Aquarius, it is often a time of significant social reform. And so we need it. We really, really need social reform right now. And we're seeing that, like I mentioned earlier, on a global level. And so I think that I personally, as an astrologer, I'm very optimistic for the next 2 or 3 years. I think a lot of these structures that are tumbling down around us as Americans, these outdated ways of being, not enough women on the Supreme Court and few women even in Congress, and people of color not being represented, et cetera, et cetera. We could go on and on and on. All of these movements that have been gaining traction the last few years are going to really start seeing results and legally mandated results, I believe. So an example, civil rights movement happened during Saturn in Aquarius, women's suffrage, Saturn in Aquarius, also several revolutions like the French Revolution, like that whole time period, Saturn was in Aquarius during part of that. So historically, we do have really good evidence of the people's will being heard because we demand it. Along with that comes resistance from those who don't want to see the social progress. But typically we see that if we do not evolve, we die. And so that is true of societies and cultures as well. And so we're in a period where the majority is going to realize, like, this is just the changing of the tide, like, get on board. So I'm optimistic in that way that we're going to start seeing some really important fundamental changes that assist our society and our global society as well.
I'm optimistic too. Thank you. Just for the listeners, all this doesn't just happen. It happens because people like you and I are making decisions that allow these things to happen. And even if it's in some small way, what can you do, or what can you say, or how can you somehow bring about the world that you want to see? Don't just expect everybody else to do it. You have to be an active participant as well. And that doesn't mean like you have to do something like huge and grand. It can just be something small in the place that you live and in the way that you interact with people. Boop, 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 boo. Well, my friends, I hope you enjoyed this interview with Eileen. I really loved her tips about taking time for silence and to reflect on our own spiritual beliefs.
Having a solitude practice to ground us and having strong values to fall back on when things get hectic are going to be really important as our world navigates some huge changes and social reform in the next few years. If you'd like to learn more about Eileen or receive an astrological consultation, check her out at eileenmello.com. And you can even text her. Yes, she did give me permission to give out her phone number, believe it or not. You can text her at 510-393-8941. And you can find her on Facebook and Instagram under the name Mello Astrologer. Mello is spelled Mello. You can find all of this information on the episode show notes on our website at rainbowsarecircles.com. And Eileen is offering $15 off her astrological consultations just for Patreon members. So make sure to visit patreon.com/rainbowsarecircles to take advantage of her generous offer. I'd actually like to give a special shout out to my 8 fantastic Patreon members as of today: Chris, Ricarda, Jesse, Kirsten, Chrissy, Billy Boy, Rachel, and June. Thank you all so much for supporting the show. It really does mean a lot to me. I really do appreciate your support. Well, that's all for today, my friends. Until next time, take good care. Happy New Year and have a magical day. Bam, ba, bam, bam, ba, bam, bam. Bam, ba, bam, bam, ba, bam, bam. Wow, 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 wow. Rainbows are circles.